Thank you, Jake, and the rest of the APPrO team. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody today. My name is Tom Levy. I'm a Senior Science and Technology Advisor with the Office of Energy Research and Development at Natural Resources Canada. Just briefly, I have about 20 years of experience in wind energy, and of course, increasingly over the years as work has evolved into grid integration and smart grid technologies, which is why I'm here today. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. So today I have the pleasure of moderating this session that's going to focus on an NRCan funded smart grid project being led by the ISO in partnership with Alectra. I'll just say a few words. The non-wires alternative approach is unique. It's looking at the functionality and interaction of technology, focusing less on that technology and more on the process of securing resources that can contribute to electricity system from a capacity and reserves perspective. So it's also about communication between the transmission system and distribution system. And at its heart, non-wires is just that, no wires, examining and demonstrating how we can meet our needs without building new infrastructure, but implementing new approaches and leveraging new tools to resolve local issues such as capacity shortfalls. We're seeing that market and regulatory solutions are necessary to deliver the modernized grid, and we certainly heard a lot about that on the last session. It's not to say that we have no technology gaps, but we know of many solutions that face hurdles that are not entirely technical in nature, where the TRL of the technology is too low from a deployment perspective. The issues are increasingly falling more to market, regulatory, or policy approaches. So for this session, we're focusing less on the technology and more on the process, what's offered, how it's measured, how it's verified, how it's released. So I'm very pleased that we can bring you all three perspectives here, the transmission system operator, the distribution system operator, and the market participant. So we're going to jump in, and I'm going to walk through a few slides on my end to just bring you up to speed on the smart grid program and where it's situating. So we'll move to slide 2, please. So some of you may be familiar with this graphic. I'll also highlight that the program team added in the bottom the changes in the numbers as of January 2019 to give you a sense of how these have changed over the last few years. Specifically, there was an increase of $753 million in total project value of the cumulative public investments, with $260 million in public investments over 316 projects since January 2019. And as you can see, they're spread from coast to coast. Next slide, please. We're in year 4 of the smart grid program. This portfolio is made up of 22 projects across Canada, 21 of which have been publicly announced. 10 projects are deployment, 5 projects are demos, and another 7 projects receive funding from both the deployment and demonstration components of the smart grid program, which we refer to as hybrids. If you're interested in digging into the details of these projects, there is a link to our smart grid brochure on the slide and is available in both English and French. The 2021 version is now online as well. Next slide, please. It's interesting to see the cross-section of utilities, and ultimately the smart grid program is representative of all utilities across Canada, and where smart grid technologies tend to be applied at the distribution level of the system. There's 13 distribution companies, 8 vertically integrated utilities, and 1 system operator. Next slide, please. We also took a quick look at ownership and the different structures by what types of projects they're doing, and it looks pretty even. Innovation and the capability to experiment with different technologies does not seem to discriminate by utility structure or utility ownership. Next slide, please. So as mentioned earlier, as more of our projects near their respective completion dates, we're going to be looking to measure the project performance against at least the top 3 outcomes identified in the initial project proposals. Some of our preliminary program observations include most of the projects with a primary focus on reliability and resilience are deployment projects. Of note, none of the projects indicated that cybersecurity is a primary focus, and as a result, this gap might warrant further discussion. So I think these slides are available, so I'm not going to spend much more time because you're definitely not here to hear me. You're here to listen to Ali and the rest of the folks on the panel. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Ali.
Thank you, Tom. Jake and APPrO and everyone in the audience for your time and your interest in this. So I'm going to walk you through a few slides here to just set up the conversation. And if we could go to the next slide, please. Before getting into the demonstration project itself, I wanted to sort of situate us in terms of DER projects within the ISO and what the ISO is up to. Just wanted to flash a diagram here from a white paper that we recently put together. The ISO, very much like the other ISO RTOs across North America, we're very interested in DER integration, and we're working on integrating DER. And the white paper that I'm showing here, we wanted to take stock of different types of DER and where they're enabled in our wholesale markets for different services to sort of start the conversation for DER integration. So this was finalized this year, but it's been in the works for a couple of years, and we've engaged stakeholders on it, and it's available for folks to take a read. Next slide, please. Similarly, I wanted to note that we have a DER roadmap in the works. So we've been working on this this past year, and the intent of the roadmap is to give stakeholders a more comprehensive view and understanding of the various DER-related projects that the ISO is undertaking. So we've laid out, or we are going to lay out, the various projects that we're working on that relate to DER, the objectives and the timelines. And of note, we've identified a few areas that the ISO has particular interest. And you'll recognize that the three areas here as very relevant to the York Region project, which touches all of these, sort of market integration, transmission distribution coordination, and non-wires as well. Next slide, please. This is just a graphic of all the DER projects in the roadmap. You'll note that the York Region demonstration project is in there. And the other one that I wanted to highlight among these projects, there's quite a few here, but we're initiating a working group, a transmission distribution coordination working group, where we're going to go deeper into the topics that we're going to be chatting about today. Next slide, please. So the demonstration itself, just to summarize what we're up to. So it's a 10 million, actually closer to $11 million project. It's funded by the ISO's Grid Innovation Fund and Tom and NRCan. When we got the project going, we developed a couple of white papers with a team from ICF. And from those white papers, we wanted to make sure that the project has a solid foundation. So we drew from those white papers, and we've adopted what we're calling the independent total DSO model in the demonstration. Independent because there's transparency, there's clear rules, and also interestingly, Alectra itself, the entity and its affiliates can't participate in the project themselves. So that sort of brings forward independence. And then the total DSO aspect, I'm going to sort of expand on that in the next couple of slides. So I'll just defer that to them. The project is very much focused on market and system operations and less so on planning issues. And it's also a merger of utility approaches. So the approaches that utilities often make use of for programs. So it's a merger of those types of approaches and the approaches in the wholesale market. So it's sort of a combination of all that. Electra, as Tom noted, is our delivery partner and doing much of the heavy lifting in the project. And we've put together a web-based platform for the demonstration. And that's really to facilitate all of the participant-facing aspects of the project. So from registration to activations to settlement information, all of that is captured in the platform. And one of the novel aspects of the project is that we're generating distribution level prices, so capacity and energy prices at that very local level. And the project generally envisions that market offers or the market processes will be used for coordination between a distribution system operator in the future and the ISO. Next slide, please. So this is from the white papers that we put together, and this is a framework that's not ours. I'm going to speak to it, but the gentleman at the bottom of the slide here put this framework together. I'm going to quickly describe a diagram to you. So on the left-hand side, a total ISO. that involves an ISO sort of extending everything down to the distribution level. There's challenges around that when it comes to scalability. There's jurisdictional issues. The tools and systems don't really exist yet for ISOs to do that. We need to crunch numbers every 5 minutes. Just at that scale, it's going to be a challenge. So that's the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, the total DSO model, that's sort of characterized by the DER participant having one interface, and that being the distribution system operator. And then the DSO, in turn, interacts with the ISO. And that's the model that we've adopted in the demonstration. And in between those two sort of bookends, there's a range of ways that things can be sliced and diced. But my favorite way of thinking about this one is actually what they're doing in New York, where they're calling it dual participation, where the DER has two interfaces. It comes to the ISO for transmission level services, goes to the DSO for distribution level services, and then there needs to be coordination across all parties to make sure that that sort of hangs together. One of the reasons why we are doing the demonstration in the manner that we're doing, where it involves distribution non-wires, is to really help them identify coordination issues and requirements. And for that same reason, we're also focused on dispatchable DER, because there's sort of that controllability aspect there as well. Next slide, please. Just wanted to touch very quickly on the demonstration area. So we went to our planners when we started this project and asked where would it be good to demonstrate these concepts, and they pointed us to Southern York region, so specifically Richmond Hill, Vaughan, and Market. What's interesting about this area is that there's existing stations, or the existing stations are reaching their limits, and there will be a need for new infrastructure towards the end of the decade into the 2030s. And so what we're doing in the demonstration, we're basically pretending, we're simulating, but we're pretending that those additional new stations are not going to be built. And instead of those, we're using DER to manage local peaks. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide. I just wanted to give you a sense of the journey we've been on. So when we got going in 2018, I noted that we had put together a couple of white papers. In 2019, we worked with an external law firm, BLG, to put together rules and contracts for the demonstration. We also, in 2020, ran the first local capacity auction, as we're referring to it, and Hamza is going to expand on all of this. This past summer, from May to October, we ran our local energy auctions, as we're referring to them. So we were effectively activating DER on hot days. And we just recently ran the second local capacity auction in the demonstration. And for that, we added a component. We added a reserve service to the demonstration. So we're going to be sort of having the local energy auctions throughout summer of 2022, but with that reserve piece included. And then we're going to start wrapping up the project. And there's a study and lessons learned and other reporting that we're going to be coming out with towards the end of the year. And with that, I think that's it for my material, and over to you, Hamza.
Thank you, Ali. I'll start off with thanking APPrO and the panel for having us. We're excited here to present to you some of the observations in terms of our program. So I'll jump right into it. Next slide, please. So in terms of our program, as Ali mentioned, our first capacity auction was last year, which was around November of 2020. 2020. What we were looking for, we were looking to procure 10 megawatts, and we've achieved that. So we ended up clearing the market for 10 megawatts. The clearing price was 64 cents per kilowatt day. The day variable here indicates the number of business days we wanted to procure those resources in the summer. So it averages out to around $80,000 per megawatt per year. In terms of the participants that cleared, we had a whole variety of participants. Some were residential thermostats. We've had supermarkets, manufacturing, as well as a district energy utility, and then a local company. So the participants, there was variety in terms of the participants, and there was also variety in terms of the DERs. We had combined heat and power, as well as load curtailment, but as well in terms of behind the meter, we did have behind the meter generation. The tree map on the left indicates just really, it shows you, the participants that cleared as well as what their capacity obligation is. As you can see, there was 2 relatively larger participants, and then there was 3 participants that were around half of the bigger ones. And then we had 2 roughly smaller participants. So it was a good variety of participants from both participants' resources as well size. Next slide, please. What I'll do now is really dive into some of the observations we had during this summer commitment period. So in the summer of 2021, between May 1st and October 31st, we had a total of 9 activations. Of those 9 activations, each activation, some activations had 4 hours, some had 3 hours. So in total, there was 30 activation hours in the commitment period. So on average, each event, you could say, was around 3 hours and 20 minutes. One of the really interesting part is how did these events align with the provincial peaks? And what we found out was 2 of the events that we had in the summer period, which were triggered to help alleviate distribution needs, was also a coincident an ICI day, or the Industrial Conservation Initiative. So it was interesting to see how participants that were activated during those days were providing benefits for both the distribution system as well as the transmission system. In terms of overall megawatt hours, so throughout the summer, participants were dispatched depending on the resource. So if you're a generator, you delivered energy. If you're a demand response, you reduced energy. But overall, 200 megawatt hours were either delivered or reduced throughout the commitment period. And in terms of peak demand reduction, around 8 megawatts of peak demand reduction was reduced. Next slide, please. In terms of how we did what we're doing in 2021, so as Ali briefly mentioned, in 2021, we did introduce a new module, which was the reserve-capable resources. But before I jump into that, in 2021, we did run an auction just last month. This time we were procuring for 15 megawatts, so more megawatts. And it was interesting to see that the price actually cleared at a less amount, so 40 cents per kilowatt, or roughly $50,000 per megawatt year. So that does signify a reduction. Keep in mind, this is a pilot. And the first year there was no history of price. And with this price discovery, you can actually see some sort of trend in a price reduction. In terms of the participants that cleared, again, a mixed bag of participants: grocery stores, behind the meter battery. But what's interesting to see here is the gray tiles. These gray tiles are reserve-capable resources, and I'll talk to more about what these resources will be providing. But in other words, almost 45% of the 15 megawatts are resources that are able to provide reserve. And what we'll do this summer, next summer, is test these resources out and see how they can provide a service from a reliability perspective. Next slide, please. So now jumping into what is reserve and what we will do in the summer of 2022. So for a typical summer, what we'll do is we'll have a load forecast, and if that load forecast exceeds the simulated threshold, what we will do is we will look at our resources to help procure this local need or local requirement. And on top of that, what we'll also do is we'll procure resources that will be used for local reserve. So that what that means is not only are we procuring for a local requirement, but hypothetically speaking, if one of those resources are scheduled for an outage or they can't provide services, we will have a local reserve resource that will jump in and help fill that gap. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide. It is a little detailed, but I think some people might find value in this. So what it helps demonstrate is how the summer of 2021 will operate. So again, there's two types of resources. There's the resources that are reserve capable, and then there's the ones that are not reserve capable. So focusing on the not reserve capable, what might happen with them is at 7 a.m., we'll run a forecast and we'll see if there is a distribution need. What we'll do is we'll issue a standby notice at 7 a.m. And then between the hours of 12 p.m. to 9 p.m., which is the availability window, which is when we're paying them to be available, we'll run our forecast, and we might see a need during that hour or that hour. So for example, the green circle at the top indicates that there's a 4-hour need. 2 hours before the need, what we'll do is we'll issue what we call an activation notice to those customers. And then those customers, those resources will deliver their energy for that 4-hour period. At the same time, what we'll do is we'll also be scheduling a local reserve for that activation hours. And so how that works, again, similarly, 2 hours before when the activation hour is, we'll issue what we call a reserve notice to those reserve capable DERs. And they'll be booked for what we're calling reserve hours. And then 30 minutes before when we actually need them, we'll issue them something called the deployment notice. And that's when they'll actually deliver electricity. So the reserve notice is a notice they get to just tell them, hey, we might need you for reserve today. Please be warm and ready. And then 30 minutes before we actually need them, we'll issue them a deployment notice. So you can definitely see that, we're incorporating new things in our pilot. We're definitely trying to test out new things. That's all for my slides, but I'm happy to answer any questions. I'll turn it over to Brady.
Thanks, Hamza. Hey, everyone. I'm Brady Klein. I'm the Senior Manager of Market Development at EnergyHub, which is a DER management system provider based in Brooklyn, New York City. Thanks to APPrO and fellow panelists for inviting me to participate today. Next slide. So after hearing from Ali and Hamza about the motivation for the pilot and progress to date, I thought I'd cover 3 additional areas around an overview of EnergyHub as a somewhat unique participant in the pilot, the mechanics of how our bring your own device delivery model works for aggregating residential DR and DER, and touch on how the York demo gets us closer, I think, to unlocking greater scale of residential DER participation in wholesale markets. So yesterday we heard from Leslie Gallinger, who told us we're at a tipping point for the future of DERs in the province. And I think it's borne out in the data and the trends we're seeing. A snapshot of penetration of DER today behind the meter in Ontario, we see roughly 200,000 internet-connected thermostats, 51,000 EVs on the road, and 35,000 rooftop solar and storage systems across residential, commercial, and industrial sectors. And this is per the ICF DER impact study that Ali alluded to earlier. Next slide. By the end of the decade, a strong uptick in thermostats, 10-fold increase in EVs on the road, and a sizable increase in rooftop solar and storage across residential and commercial sectors in aggregate amounts to over 4 gigawatts of DER capacity that will be available to provide grid services to the IESO and to each of the LDCs. Next slide. And platforms like EnergyHubs help provide the pathway to harnessing the potential of those grid edge resources as part of market or demand response programs. And you can advance once more. So the way we do this is go out and integrate with all of the leading DER manufacturers to enroll and monitor and control DR resources for these audiences. Demand side management and network operators as part of distribution utilities, bulk power system operators like the IESO, and the customer stakeholders that allow us to build the resource in the first place and enroll and aggregate resources. Next slide. And you can advance one more. So we've brought that model mostly to demand side management programs in the US, to a portfolio of over 60 DR programs. I think we're probably most known that the bulk of our business is in residential DR aggregation with electric and gas distribution utilities in the US, but we participate in the wholesale markets as well. I've participated in the ERCOT market for the better part of a decade, in the CAISO and PJM. And next slide. The York NWA demonstration is our entree into the Canadian market. And we'll talk more about motivations, I think, as part of the Q&A, but really optimistic about how the York NWA paves the way toward greater residential DER aggregation in the IESO administered markets, and look forward to engaging in that overall DER market vision exercise with lessons learned from the demonstration. Next slide. So how does this all work? How does the bring your own device model actually allow us to build a resource that can be reliable and delivered to the IESO through the capacity auctions? So it's pretty straightforward. Yeah, you can go back one. The way that EnergyHub facilitates DR is basically by using the mobile and web app experiences that you're accustomed to. When you go to adjust your thermostat on a daily basis, you would see an offer notifying you about the opportunity to participate in an aggregation, eligibility rules, the incentive. You would sign up for the customer T's and C's and apply for the program. Next slide. When enrollments are processed in our platform through verifying eligibility behind the scenes with Hamza and the Alectra team, customers are notified of their application status. And as soon as they're accepted in our platform, they're automatically available for demand response through the integrations that EnergyHub has with each respective thermostat manufacturer. Next slide. And here are some of those notices that Hamza was referring to around standby that you might get in the morning and scheduled dispatch instructions later in the day for a non-reserve capable resource, as an example. Next slide. EnergyHub takes those signals, schedules demand response events in our platform, which are in turn communicated down to the thermostat manufacturers and their respective participants enrolled in the program. And all the participants are notified of the demand response event. They have the ability to opt out anytime through the device, through the thermostat itself, or within the mobile and web apps that they're using to control the thermostat. Next slide. And through our integration with the manufacturers, we're collecting runtime data from all the devices in the aggregation in near real time and surfacing that for the operator in the DERMS to measure the impact of market dispatch as the event progresses and after the fact. And next slide. So where is it all going? I think I wanted to touch on the importance of the York demo from EnergyHub's perspective, hopefully more broadly from a residential aggregator's perspective, looking to evaluate market opportunities across any given of 9 wholesale energy markets in North America. I think there are common barriers we would have to weigh and consider when evaluating the opportunity to bring load to any of these markets, most of which revolve around the frequency and granularity with which settlement data has to be shared with the market, the demand response baselines that are used to evaluate the resource, and are they appropriate for the resource types that customers want to bring? Is real-time telemetry required, as will be the case with Order 2222 participation of DER aggregations in FERC jurisdictions? Are there barriers for customers to participate? Is it confusing, or are there extra steps to authorize data sharing that might discourage them from bringing load to an aggregation? And are there dispatch parameters like 12-hour events that might be burdensome and onerous for customers and discourage them from participating in the first place? And what I get excited about is that the York demo alleviates most of these and almost acts like a letter from the future of residential DR aggregation, in that it shows we can deliver a reliable DR resource without the need to do all of these things. And I think the goal for us now is to take these lessons learned from the York demo and apply them in the IESO administered markets and elsewhere at ISOs in the US, and hopefully unlock hundreds of megawatts of residential DER for participating in grid services at the wholesale level, in addition to traditional retail DR programs. That's all I've got. Looking forward to the Q&A.
Great. That was great, gentlemen. I appreciate all of these interesting presentations. We're gonna dive into some questions. We've used the word motivation a few times, And just while people are thinking of things that might be on their mind and they want to ask, I'll start you all off. And so I want to explore that. What's the motivation? We got 3 different perspectives here. Why are you motivated to be involved in this demonstration specifically, but then just kind of the broader DER question and what it means for you. So we'll go Ali, then Hamza, then Brady, if you don't mind.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I'll get us started. Yeah, I mean, I think I touched on these points earlier as well, but from an ISO perspective, we're interested in understanding and learning about different distribution system operator models and what that means from a wholesale market or transmission operations perspective. And along those lines, if there's distribution services in the future, how is that going to be coordinated with wholesale market services? So that's sort of the core of it. But maybe taking a step back, I also come from a economics, contracting, markets background. And sort of the literature around all of that, going back several decades around locational marginal prices, like that, those concepts are very well understood, well accepted. But in the recent past, there's been more and more focus around the distribution system and to what extent those concepts can be extended into the distribution system. So for instance, again, with respect to locational marginal prices, can we generate distribution locational marginal prices in the future? And how do that hang together with LMP at the transmission level? And especially when I think about a transactive energy future where there is automation and there's devices that respond to signals without humans being in the loop, sort of that various sort of granular services, granular prices makes a lot of sense to me. And as a final thought, maybe before turning it to the other panelists, we also, the ISO, we talked to the other ISO RTOs across North America quite a bit. We also talked to the US national labs and academics across the sector. And it's, folks have remarked to us that we're a little bit different from the other ISO RTOs. As much as everybody's looking to integrate DER into the wholesale markets, we seem to be unique in our very sort of detailed interest around, again, VSOs and distribution services and sort of anticipating that and starting to work on again, how that's going to work in the future.
Great. Hamza, what are your thoughts? What's motivating you?
So I think, where I can start is when we look at these DERs, first, like a lot of these DERs are connected to the distribution system, right? And if we don't help harmonize and manage how they're operated, it's going to be very challenging in the future, right? So one of the things that we were really interested is the coordination. How do we coordinate, whether it's registration, contracting, dispatching these resources, and even settling with these resources? And then what was also more interesting is adding the interoperability aspect and aggregating these resources and actually potentially looking into bidding these resources into the ISO market in the future, right? So we know the resources are there, they're connected to the grid. We were really keen on, okay, how can we unlock the value of these resources to help manage the grid more efficiently? I'll leave it there, and I think there's more questions I can touch on.
Thanks, Brady.
Yeah, I think that I agree with everything Hamza and Ali mentioned. And in addition to those, at the risk of being a broken record, I think we set out to demonstrate the reliability of residential DR and providing quickly dispatchable wholesale market services, or services that both benefit both stakeholders here, right? Distribution and transmission, and the interface between the two. I think selfishly for me, demonstrating the removing sort of traditional barriers around operational coordination amongst all of those parties, and the fact that data is often siloed between those 3 parties, i.e. participant, distribution, wholesale, that it doesn't have to be so hard, that there don't have to be unnecessarily burdensome telemetry requirements, for instance. It doesn't on a a faster response resource, it might make sense, but for a longer term planning capacity resource, maybe not so much. And so I think our motivation is to both participate where we can and figure out where are those places that align with people that agree with us, but also demonstrate to the rest of the organized markets that residential DR and DER aggregation doesn't have to be so complicated, and there are certain use cases that are kind of a slam dunk for this kind of thing. And NWA might be the perfect alignment of all of those three things. And so why not prove that and not just scream it into the panel audience?
Yeah, there's an economic play, whether it's about making money or saving money in some fashion, some way. It creates value. And then, of course, reliability fits on top of all of it. Interesting. So there is a question in the audience. So I know we had a few pre-prepared just in case, but and that was certainly one of them. And I'll like to get to more, but I'm gonna put this out there for you to think about. And I say you as all three of you. What's the biggest challenge you've seen in this demo project? I'm gonna start with Hamza because you kind of sit right in the middle, and see if you got any thoughts you want to share with us on your biggest challenges.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you, Tom. One of the challenges we've noticed was when it comes to a metering infrastructure perspective. Given that it was a pilot, we wanted to leverage as much of our existing assets as possible. So we were using, regular customer metering that we normally use for monthly billing, right? And when you put yourself in the customer's shoes and you're asked to be dispatched for a 4-hour event, the customer needs to know, how is he doing right now? And let's say 1 hour in the event, did he achieve that, load curtailment, right? And unfortunately, we weren't, we're still investigating how we can reduce that metering latency and being able to provide the customer with an almost near real-time metering experience. So when he's being activated, he can actually see, okay, I'm meeting my activation notice, versus wait 48 hours, when the meter's ready to actually run the M&V. So I think I'll highlight, the metering challenges we've had, specifically related to meter latency, as I'd like to call it. I'll leave it to Brady and Ali to maybe bring some of the customer or the ISO perspective.
So the floor is open. Ali or Brady, you guys can rock, paper, scissors. See who goes first, or Ali, you got off mic first, so you get the first crack after.
Sounds good. And I'll along the lines of what Hamza was just discussing around metering, there's another sort of issue that comes to mind. So when we were designing the reserve service for the second year of the demonstration, we wanted to be as inclusive as possible and open that up to as many of the participants and DER technology types as possible. But we found it a bit challenging around residential aggregations. So the smart meters in Ontario, as I understand it, they generally have 15-minute data intervals or less or longer intervals. And that from a reserve perspective, when we are going to deploy with short notice, but also want to have the granular data to see what the response was so that we can do M&V after the fact as well. That was a bit of it was a challenge, a barrier, and we ultimately excluded residential aggregations from that reserve service. So I guess my thought is, and Hamza and other folks probably have more insight into this, but to what extent is that sort of settings on smart meters, or is that a limitation in the smart metering technology? And to what extent, as we sort of deploy the next generation of smart meters in Ontario, is there an opportunity to ensure that sort of more granular metering is in place? And it's in particular if we see value in having residential aggregations providing reserve. And so there's a bit of a cost benefit analysis there, I think.
Brady, anything to add?
Yeah, among other challenges, I think risk management for an aggregation built up of many small parts comes to top of mind. And that our DER customers aren't signing interconnection agreements that allow you to aggregate a fixed megawatt that you are bidding. And coming up with the statistical likelihood of getting out when you press the DR button, making sure that you're hitting 3 megawatts or 2.5 and that you're ramping at the appropriate speed is obviously more challenging when you're dealing with more moving pieces. And we've got the kind of foundational analytics to do that, but it's when you have 0 data points for how your DR resources performed in Ontario, given regional factors and customer behavior and the housing stock, I think the unpredictability of pushing the DR button for the first test event, I think, is a big question mark in the first season. And you take those learnings and you roll them over to the next season. But then yet again, how much are you going to clear? And do you know whether you're going to be able to deliver everything you have, or maybe you don't have enough? And so managing, that trade-off, I think, is probably the toughest part of this for us.
The deep breath before the plunge. Ali, you had mentioned the reserve product, and Hamza, you would also. Can you expand on that? Why are you developing a distribution level reserve product? We got 3 minutes to go. So
I can go quickly, Hamza, and then turn it to you. So as I mentioned, we added a reserve service in the second year. We could have sort of repeated our first year, but we wanted to be ambitious and advance the conversation. And so we spent a bit of time talking to consultants and other folks in the sector just to make sure that our thinking around a distribution reserve service that it sort of makes sense. And to be clear, it's not that there's DER that are providing a wholesale market reserve service. It's DER providing a distribution level reserve service to the distribution system operator or the distributor. And the thinking there is that, and I think Hamza sort of touched on this when he was talking about reserves. So with non-wires, that's effectively a reliability service. The DER must be there, otherwise there's going to be problems. But what if there's some DER that are on forced outage? You need to have some backup DER to help with that, and that's where sort of the concept comes from. The transmission level reserves are not deliverable to the distribution system. So the DSO or the distributor needs to have its own reserves to lean on. So that's sort of how we approach that issue. And as soon as you introduce, and this is very novel, I think we're the only project out there that has or has been thinking about distribution level reserves. But a really interesting sort of topic around this is the DER simultaneously providing distribution reserves and transmission reserves, and sort of that stacking notion. And that's something that we're very keen on exploring further.
Yeah, it's very novel. Hamza, do you have anything you want to add on that?
Just quickly, when we looked at it, we were trying to look at unlocking as much value as we can from these resources. And one of the things that comes up when we're speaking to system planners is reliability, right? So we went back and we looked at, okay, how can we improve reliability? And it came down to including reserve. So now we're going to, in year 2, we're going to actually be using reserves for 2 areas. The first area is, what if the customer that was issued an activation notice does not show up? So that was a risk, and now we can actually mitigate it by having reserve. The other risk that any operational room expert will have is related to your forecast. And if your forecast is off, you need something to help with that. And that's where reserves is going to come in. So I think, we looked at our risks and we've identified 2, and we found a product that I think can address both those risks.
Great. Brady, you're going to get last word here. What's the economic potential of these non-wires alternative and DERs?
Yeah, I'll relish being the last word of the last conference of the last day of the panel. I see DER doing more things, right? And I think NWA is just a way of pinpointing where you should start. And I think if we fast forwarded this 5 years, I see lots of DERs at scale with third parties or with LDCs aggregating as the DSO, morphing between providing distribution services and transmission services with excess capacity back and forth on a daily basis continuously. And that an NWA isn't necessarily about permanent energy efficiency savings or about peak reduction when it's most costly, but continuous permanent load shaping and just a much more kind of many more DERs doing many more things all the time operationally. And I think that's the direction we're going.
Love it. Actually, I'll take the last word. I'm very excited about these types of projects. I think that this electrified future of electrified end uses, we're certainly seeing through these types of projects that they provide more levers and buttons to the system operators and the utilities. And if we can create the environment in which end user uptake and utility uptake of these solutions, I think we're certainly all going to be better for it. So thank you all on the panel. Thank you, Jake and Steve, on our audio-visual support. I really appreciate it. Thank you for listening to our panel. This concludes our session, and I believe it concludes APPrO. So over to you, Sean.
And that brings us to the end of APPrO 2021, the Canadian Power Conference. Another really stimulating and fascinating round of discussions on issues that really affect us all in one way or another. If you'd like to keep exploring or find more information, you can continue using this conference platform until February of 2022. Recordings of the live streams will be posted next week. Thanks for joining us. Hope to see you all again soon. My name is Sean Mallon. Thanks for joining us.